So Jerry, as it relates to C.S. Lewis, Jerry has taught courses at many different seminaries, Bible colleges. Um, Actually, we were on a campus 2 years ago, and together where we taught on C.S. Lewis. And Jerry's also written a number of articles and contributed to. I just jotted down a couple of the books, and I want to ask you to share about your latest book briefly here as we get started. So, The Soul of C.S. Lewis, The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis, The Neglected C.S. Lewis, which is one of your more recent books, and The Quotable C.S. Lewis. And then let's see, your latest one, Splendor into the, how is it Splendor?
Splendor in the dark.
In the dark. I had,
It's a quote from C.S. Lewis.
yeah, yeah, from Dimer, right?
Right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that, and then just take off from there on miracles.
Okay. Dimer was a 100-page narrative poem that C.S. Lewis wrote before he was a Christian. And it was published 5 years before his conversion. I think there is much in that book that is suggestive of what is to come in Lewis. I think there is much in that book that helps us see where he was at that period of his life. And even though it was a failed attempt, he got some good reviews on the book, but nobody bought it. And so in some senses, he felt like he failed as a poet. And consequently, it was because of that book, he stopped writing poetry and focusing on becoming a well-accepted poet and moved instead towards his prose. So in some senses, we're all beneficiaries of Dimer because Lewis became that most memorable prose writer that we encounter. So anyway, I think it's an important book. I gave these as lectures at Wheaton College. Each one had a faculty respondent. The faculty respondents, not one of them liked Lewis's poem. And their responses to the lectures were some of the most humorous things I've ever been a part of. At least they were kind to me. One of them said, Jerry's lecture on Dimer is way better than Dimer itself. So I was grateful that they didn't castigate my academic work, but they did take issue with Lewis. Nevertheless, it's a great literary artifact. If you're interested in Lewis and you want to understand him as a whole author, you should understand these few bits and pieces of his pre-Christian writing as well. I think you'll see how they had an effect. There's even some longing expressed in this book, longing that really drove Lewis throughout his life. But let's turn our attention to miracles now. I want to suggest to you that this is perhaps the most sophisticated of all of his popular apologetic books. You all know A Problem of Pain, which was his first popular apologetic, and then also Mere Christianity, which were his radio broadcast talks that were turned into a book that has had wide-ranging readership. Many people have come to Christ through that particular book too. But Miracles is the most sophisticated. We see hints of it in his autobiography. Well, he wrote his autobiography after he wrote Miracles, not long after. But nevertheless, in his autobiography, he talks about some of the struggles that led to his conclusions that we encounter in Miracles when he writes about his earlier days. Why did he write the book? There's much to suggest in a letter that Dorothy Sayers wrote to him, that she was the one that nudged him in that direction to address this issue of supernaturalism in an age of materialism and naturalism. And so Lewis went to that effect. I'm just going to, talk through the argument of the book. And he begins with a short chapter called The Scope of This Book. And he basically observes, rightly so, I think, that presuppositions that we bring to any question can often affect how we look at that question and how we come out with our answers. In some senses, our presuppositions can often cause us to beg the question, to settle the issue before we've ever really wrestled with the dynamics that are at play. I'll give you some examples. It was Charles Williams, Lewis's good friend, who wrote this. Not one mind in 1,000 can be trusted to state accurately what its opponent says much less what he thinks. We're too busy projecting onto those we disagree with rather than actually hearing what they have to say. And then also Basil Mitchell, who was a friend of Lewis's. He was actually my doctoral supervisor. He was the one that was the vice president of the Oxford Socratic Club when Lewis was the president. And when Lewis went to Cambridge University, Mitchell became the president of the Oxford Socratic Club, a club where one week a Christian would read a paper and the non-Christians would respond. The next week, a non-Christian would read a paper and the Christians would respond. And it was just a lively debate that was going on at Oxford for years, all during term, one evening a week. Anyway, Mitchell, quoting John Locke, wrote this: "Whatsoever credit or authority we give to any proposition more than it receives from the principles and proofs it proves itself on is owing to our inclination that way." So we can come to the question of miracles and we could have presuppositions, i.e., we could be a supernaturalist and believe that miracles are certainly possible. Or we could be a naturalist or a materialist and say there is no God, there are no miracles, and all the data for the materialists, they already have concluded there are no miracles, so we've got to dig around to find the natural explanation. The supernaturalist could say there might be a natural explanation, but there actually might be some intervention by the supernatural. Consequently, I would suggest to you from the outset that the supernaturalist can always, on this issue, be far more open-minded than the naturalist or the materialist could ever be. So the question then is to find out whatever presuppositions we bring to the question, to see on whose side the preponderance of the evidence lies. Are there miracles? Are they possible? And if they are possible, what do they look like? How do we understand them? Lewis goes on in 3 different chapters: the naturalist and supernaturalist, the self-contradiction of the naturalist, and nature and supernature, chapters 2, 3, and 4 in the book, to then explain some basic presuppositions that we should consider if we're going to wrestle fair-mindedly with the matter of miracles. He observes that the basic question of ontology, and ontology, by the way, is the study of being or existence. If we live in a universe where there are things that can both be and not be, we live in a universe of contingencies. Your being here is contingent upon the fact that your folks got together years ago, you were conceived. They were there because their folks had gotten together and conceived, and so on. And consequently, in a universe of contingencies, it can't be a continual cycle ad infinitum. The basic ontological question is, if anything exists in the universe at all of contingencies, there must be something that is eternal, transcendent, and necessary. Remember when you were a child and you took dominoes and you set them up on the coffee table and serpentined them all around? Something outside the dominoes had to exist in order to set them up. You knocked the first one over and it started this string of chain reaction where they all knocked each other over. Hopefully if you set them up, you got to knock them over. If your little brother or sister came and knocked them over, then you knocked your brother or sister down. It created a different set of contingencies. Nevertheless, the domino illustration helps us understand what's at play in this basic ontological question. If anything in a universe of contingencies exists at all, something has to be outside of the string of contingencies. Something has to be necessary. Now, the question is, what is necessary? And while the question is complex and we could go into all kinds of nuanced detail, for the time that we have here, I'm going to be looking at more general principles. But there are basically 3 different big picture categories, each one with bunches of nuances within them that have been suggested. The one view is, well, things just happened. They just sort of occurred. And so all of a sudden, out of nothing came something with no cause behind it. You pick this up even in the realm of some people who we would have expected more from them. Years ago, PBS did a series called Cosmos, and it was hosted by an astrophysicist, a brilliant University of Chicago astrophysicist named Carl Sagan. And Carl Sagan would talk about the glory and the beauty and the symmetry of things in the universe, that if they were just a little bit out of kilter, everything in this area that he's looking at would fall apart. They wouldn't exist at all. And then Carl Sagan, as he talks about this stuff, says, and the remarkable thing is, it just happened. He says this over and over again in that series. And I start laughing as I think about it. Carl Sagan was a brilliant astrophysicist, one of the best of his time. He was not a very good metaphysicist. His ontology was not so good. And here's why I say that. When I was a boy, if I was playing in my room and I got some crayons out and I started marking on the wall in my room, if I would have discarded the crayons and went on to another toy, and my mother came into the room and she would have seen marking on the wall, if she would have given me the benefit of the doubt, seeing me the only child that play in that room, Jerry, how did that marking get on the wall? If I would have acted surprised and say, wow, Mom, I don't know. It must have just happened. I would have been spanked twice for that. Once for lying and once for marking on the wall. But Carl Sagan could say it just happened and he was able to call it science. How did he get away with that? If you read in the Bible, there's a place where somebody tries to explain his action that way. Moses was up on Mount Sinai. He was getting the law from God. Children of Israel are getting restless down below. They go to Aaron, who is their spiritual leader, and they say, we don't know what happened to this Moses guy. Make us a God that we could worship him. So Moses gets their golden earrings and melts them down and fashions this golden calf and puts it up and says, this is the God that led you out of Egypt. Worship him. Moses gets word of it. He comes down. He's furious at Aaron. He says, what possessed you to do this? And Aaron says, you know how obnoxious these people are. They wanted a God to worship. I took their golden earrings and I put them in this pot, and out came this calf. And we read that explanation and we go, come on. How stupid could he have been at that moment? We know Aaron was brilliant, but at that moment, it wasn't one of his best moments. And so consequently, we laugh at it because we see the nonsense in the explanation. And we should see the nonsense also whenever somebody says it just happened. You think through it inferentially. If something happens by chance, then we can infer from that it has no direction. If it has no direction, then it's not moving towards any particular end or purpose, and it has no meaning. On the other hand, if you have something that has a causal direction, then it could be moving purposefully, and there can be meaning. If you look at the universe as a job description, what possible answer comes to mind when you consider the options that have been offered? So anyway, it just happened doesn't no serious thinkers about this take that particular issue seriously. You've never heard of a person putting up a canvas on an artist's easel and just looking at it, there's a Rembrandt, or some baby that gives birth to itself, or some building that builds itself. It's rather silly, actually. But then we move to the next position, and it's the position of the naturalist. And the naturalist sees the underlying ontological question and says, basically, well, what I have to say is that nature has always been there. Matter is eternal. And it just reconfigures itself by virtue of its response to certain forces and so on. But if the materialist says matter is eternal, you ask the question, and well, that may be so, but when was the last time you had a good conversation with a rock? In other words, if it's just matter, where do ideas come from? Where does the sense of justice, or where does the idea of love? When a man looks at a woman, she projects an image on the retina of his eye, and he thinks maybe he loves her, or he likes her, or he's intrigued. What's going on there? And the materialist says, hey, listen, it's just matter. You say, well, explain yourself. He says, the image is projected on the retina of the eye. It travels along the optic nerve to the brain, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. And the person says it's love, but it's not love. It's just chemistry. It's all biochemistry. Actually, before Lewis was a Christian, he had bought into that position. And then all of a sudden, when he saw the contradiction in the position, it shook him. It was a great disadvantage equilibrium. It broke him out of his materialism. And he understood this, that if the materialist explains that this is the cause of things like love or ideas or justice, that it's just chemistry, the materialist has looked at the lovers and they projected an image on the retina of his eye. Through a series of electrical synapses, it travels along his optic nerve, stimulates his brain, causes accretion of particular hormones, and he says it's an explanation. If the lovers can't say love, then he can't say explanation either. And basically, Lewis comes to the conclusion that he cannot believe that reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. These are things that he says in the Book of Miracles. And he begins to understand this. All possible knowledge, he writes, then depends on the validity of reason. And if reason exists, it must exist for a reason that goes deeper than the materialist explanation. By the way, those of you that really like C.S. Lewis and you read on February 2nd, 1948, it was basically over these concepts in the Book of Miracles. Anscombe herself was a Christian, but she argued against Lewis because Lewis had made a statement in another paper he read at the Oxford Socratic Club that he didn't think the materialists could reason or could come up with a good reason. And she said no. She believed that Lewis was right. The materialist presuppositions were wrong. But she thought a materialist could start with a good proposition and through a series of inferences, reason to a conclusion. And they debated this. Later, years later, Lewis changed this chapter in Miracles to reflect his response to Anscombe. On the other hand, Basil Mitchell, who I mentioned to you earlier, he restaged the debate and had Anscombe come back and debate. And the philosopher at Oxford, John Lucas, took Lewis aside. And he said, hands down, he thought that Lucas won the debate. Mitchell was also at the original debate. The key, though, is they weren't arguing about God's existence. They were arguing about the use of the word valid and whether or not a materialist can make a valid argument. My opinion is that they were arguing like this. Lewis was saying their presuppositions are not valid, and Anscombe saying even if their presuppositions are not valid, it's possible for a person whose presuppositions may be faulty who could still argue a point on some other topic. Anyway, the position Lewis takes, and the position that would make miracles possible, is that something immaterial is eternal. And so consequently, if something immaterial is eternal, then there remains the belief that God created nature. And if he created nature, then he created the possibility of reason. We know that there are things that are going on chemically in the brain, cerebral biochemistry, we may call it, but it is not enough to account for these kinds of problems that I just mentioned to you. Actually, if you go back and read Plato, Plato was aware of the problem. Consciousness itself suggests something that is beyond the conscious itself. The fact that I can have memory before I come to an experience and record that experience in my memory. The fact that I can think about something must be prior to the ideas that I'm thinking about. Where does it come from? Now, Plato, as he talks about it, he suggests that maybe we had prior existence. The Christian would say, like Lewis would say, no, there was a creator God, and the creator God made these things possible. Well, in the immaterial or the supernaturalist position, there's no inherent contradiction like you find in the materialist position. Matter of fact, it even says in Hebrews chapter 11, by faith we believe that that which is seen was made by that which is unseen, but has eternality to it and has omnipotence and the power to create and so on. Lewis writes in Miracles, no philosophical theory which I have yet come across is a radical improvement on the words of Genesis that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, there's a further difficulty that Lewis talks about in this book in chapters 5 and 6, a further difficulty in naturalism and answers to misgivings. Lewis says you cannot prove that there are no proofs, just like you cannot prove there is no truth. If somebody says to you, there is no truth, You just ask them, do you believe that statement is true? And they just contradict themselves right and left. Lewis wrote, I believe the primary moral principles on which all others depend are also rationally perceived. So he sees reason and morality even linked. We just see that there is no reason why my neighbor's happiness should be sacrificed to my own, as we just see that things that are equal to the same things are equal to one another. If we cannot prove either axiom, that is not because they are irrational, but because they are self-evident, and all proofs depend upon them. Their intrinsic reasonableness shines by its own light. And he writes, it is because all morality is based on such self-evident principles that we may say to a man when we would call him to right conduct, be reasonable. If we share the same nature of another person, then it stands to reason that we deserve the same treatment as them, and we ought to afford them the same treatment that we would want. Do unto others as you would be done by makes moral sense. The standard is therefore objective. Confucius in the Analects writes about this. He says, don't do to somebody else what you wouldn't want them to do to you. Lewis observes this in his book, The Abolition of Man, as he notices the objective, self-referential basis for morality. And also Lewis makes the observation that the Christian position, very similar to Confucius, but I think far more developed, the Christian position is do to somebody else what you would want them to do to you. So you can live your whole life never doing any harm to anybody and fulfill Confucius's dictates. But the Christian would say, you can't go through life without magnanimity, without care for others, and so on, doing to them what you would want done to you. And how do you know you should do this? Because you share the same nature as human beings. And you would want to be treated this way. And we can just see it if we understand who we are and understand our place in a world with others like us. Lewis suggests there is not only a supernatural source behind rational thought, there's also a supernatural source behind moral judgments. This is very similar to his starting place in Mere Christianity, where he begins with the moral argument for God's existence. The moral argument is a compelling one, and Lewis makes the case quite strongly in Mere Christianity, especially as it is added to the other great naturalistic arguments for God's existence. The cosmological argument, the argument from cause and effect, teleological argument, things move towards ends. We see development in nature and in the world, and we can set our watches by the kinds of movements we see in the heavens. The pragmatic argument too, truth should work. Not all things that work are true, but truth should work. And consequently, in his book, The Justification of Religious Belief, Basil Mitchell makes it clear that the cumulative effect of these arguments is compelling. Mortimer Adler, in his book, How to Think About God, a guide for the 20th century pagan, a book he wrote before he became a Christian, he set forth the cumulative effect of these arguments, and he says they're beyond a reasonable doubt. A thinking person should look at this. Lewis is arguing along these lines in Miracles as well. You can also see others have written about this. If you're a liberal arts person, you're very much aware of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. By the way, Jean-Paul Sartre, when he wrote his work Existentialism, borrows from Dostoevsky. In Existentialism, Sartre says, Dostoevsky said there is no God. And if there is no God, there is no morality, because there's no basis, no transcendent basis for morality. And Sartre, who was an atheist at that time, he becomes a theist at the end of his life, but who is an atheist at that time, says that's what we atheist existentialists believe. There is no God. There is no basis for morality. You can get out of your car and help an old lady across the street, or if you see the old lady crossing the street, you can accelerate and knock her down. There's no basis for morality. There is no God. There's no determinant, no foundation, no end to which these things move. Well, interestingly enough, he's quoting Karamazov, but Karamazov's character in that novel, who makes this claim, if there is no God, there is no morality, everything is permissible, is the Karamazov son, Ivan. And basically, the book is an exploration of that particular value and shows its bankruptcy. Sartre doesn't pick up on the bankruptcy, he just picks up on the presupposition, but it comes out short. The supernatural, Lewis writes, is not remote and abstruse. It is a matter of daily and hourly experience, as intimate as breathing. As a matter of fact, he says, denial of it, denial of the supernatural, denial of morality, denial of these primary principles and first things and ontological realities, denial of it depends on a certain absent-mindedness. He writes this in Miracles. The 16th century was when science was born. Now, this is Lewis, who writes an entire exposition on that period in English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. A brilliant book. It's about 700 pages long. You might think, oh man, how can I ever get through this? It's so long. It gives new meaning to the word eternal. No, you read that book, you're going to laugh your way through. Lewis is winsome, he's humorous, he's perceptive, he's clear. Anybody can follow the argument in the book and so on. But he talks about the fact that in some senses, science was born in the 16th century, the 1500s, science as we know it now. But he also wrote that during the same period, men of science were coming to be metaphysically and theologically uneducated. Lewis writes this in Miracles. It's true. I think I've mentioned on these Zooms before of a Brown University biochemistry major who came to me and said she doesn't believe in the supernatural because she operates on the principle that if she can't prove it empirically, she just doesn't buy it. And I said to her, that's the principle you operate on? If you can't perceive it empirically, you don't buy it? She said, yeah. I said, would you please set the principle forth for me empirically? She opened her eyes big and she got it. She saw the problem with her own principle. It was inherently contradictory because it's a principle. It can't be set forth empirically. And she said, why, everybody where I go to school believes this. I said, no, there's Christians there too. You'd be surprised they get everywhere. But what was at loss was she may have been bright. She may have been able to do well in biochemistry, a very challenging major. But the problem was she was metaphysically and theologically uneducated. Her philosophy was deficient. And consequently, I would say that there was some work that needed to be done. Lewis goes on to say, the state of affairs in which ordinary people can discover the supernatural only by abstruse reasoning is recent, and by his historical standards, it's abnormal. It's abnormal. And it also is very limiting to the bare material parts of our existence. We are people who have a material embodiment, but we're certainly more than that. Just like reason is more than cerebral biochemistry. And consequently, then, we reduce ourselves to the mere animalistic rather than seeing beyond it. John Polkinghorne at Cambridge University, a physicist who was there, said if you ask the physicist, why is the kettle boiling? The physicist could say, well, heat from the burners agitating the molecules and causing the water to boil in the kettle at 100 degrees centigrade. You can test it over and over again, find the same result. He said, that's true. But you could also answer the question, the kettle is boiling because I wanted a cup of tea, and would you want one too? And by mere scientific investigation, you could never get to the second answer. Mortimer Adler, the philosopher at University of Chicago, made this observation. In 4 generations, we've gone from saying that which is useful for science, that which is measurable and is useful for science, is the only thing that's useful and important. In 4 generations, we've gone that way. And this kind of tyranny of the materialist is taking over our culture. And I don't think that we're better off because of it. The scientists do wonderful things. I'm grateful for what they do. I'm grateful the way that engineers apply it. But the deal is they can put wonderful tools in our hands, but they can't tell us, do we have the kind of morality to manage those tools? Or may we use them in a horrible way? May we engage in tyrannies that allow us to destroy other people by these tools that we've been given? And it seems to me there's something that has to go on that gives us not only the ability to see the morality that transcends the mere material, but also the morality that reveals our own deficiencies and drives us to one who could set us right inside, right with God, right with one another, and so on. And consequently, I would say also that Lewis recognizes that this human reason and morality, he writes, have been mentioned not as instances of miracle, but as proofs of the supernatural. So he's trying to build the case for the supernatural first, and then he'll bring that presupposition. Remember at the beginning, we bring presuppositions to the data. Do you bring a naturalist presupposition, or do you bring a supernaturalist? He's trying to show that the supernaturalist position is real. And if the supernaturalist position is real, if the materialists will only bring their materialist perspective to any given question, they come less open-minded and basically more challenged. And so Lewis, having set this up, now he's ready to move on to do miracles occur? Lewis wrote in his book Miracles, it is a mere confusion of thought to suppose that advancing science has made it harder for us to accept miracles. We always knew they were contrary to the natural course of events. We know still that if there is something beyond nature, they're possible. Those are the bare bones of the question. Time and progress and science and civilization have not altered them in the least. The grounds for believing and disbelief are the same today as they were 2,000 or 10,000 years ago. Lewis defines a miracle as an interference with nature by a supernatural power. And he also observes, therefore, it's inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. They do not. And Lewis is very careful here. If God makes nature to run a particular way, he can't both make it to run that way and then interrupt the way that it runs by violating the laws that are undergirding it. There has to be something else that goes on here. Augustine wrote in The City of God something similar to what Lewis writes. A miracle, therefore, happens not contrary to nature, but contrary to what we know of nature. This suggests this metaphor in miracles, therefore. Miracle, if nature brings forth miracles, then doubtless it is as natural for her to do so when impregnated by the masculine force beyond her as it is for a woman to bear children to a man. They don't break the laws of nature, but they apply something, as Augustine said, that was contrary to what we knew of nature, i.e., that there's something supernatural that stands behind the world that we know. And when he operates consistent with the laws of nature. It's a little bit reflected in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The White Witch, she thinks she knows the magic from the dawn of time. And Aslan says after he raises from the dead, he says the White Witch knew of a magic from the dawn of time, but she didn't know of the magic before the dawn of time. And so too, we recognize there's a God who created time, who created this universe. And he operates in that universe in ways that are coherent and consistent. And consequently, he can bring forth children, the miracles of this universe, as a man can bring conception to a woman. Lewis then explains further, the rightful demand that all reality should be consistent and systematic does not therefore exclude miracles, but it has a very valuable contribution to make to our conception of it. It reminds us that miracles, if they occur, must, like all events, be revelations of the total harmony of all that exists and nothing arbitrary. It's interesting, the Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God, the earth showeth his handiwork. The Bible says that that which is known about God is evident to them, for God made it evident. For since the beginning of creation, his divine nature and invisible attributes are clearly seen in what is made. The materialist has blinded his eyes. By contrast, Calvin said in the Institutes, God dons the garment of creation. And if we look honestly and fair-mindedly at that world, we see that it is more than what the naturalists or the materialists can explain. There's more operational here. By definition, Lewis says, miracles must, of course, interrupt the usual course of nature. But if they are real, they must, at the very act of doing so, assert all the more the unity and self-consistency of total reality at some deeper level. Well, Lewis goes on to talk about how do we talk about these things. And when he does, he mentions that we often will use the terms of imagination and metaphor, analogy, and so on. It's not untypical. Scientists do it all the time. A scientist doesn't know something. So a scientist begins with an imaginative exercise. They cast a hypothesis. Through a series of testing, They see if the hypothesis has validity. The hypothesis itself is an imaginative guess, a hunch, imaginatively displayed. And as they test it, if they find that it's false, they discard it. If they find that there's something to give it merit, they test it some more, and eventually they're able to establish some fact, or maybe even establish a fact that is so continual that they would call it a law. They go on to describe what they've discovered. What do they use to describe what they've discovered? They use models. These are not the thing itself, but depictions of the models. And Lewis talks about the fact that we're always using these kinds of analogies to discuss anything. You have what he calls a pupil's metaphor. The pupil doesn't know, so they say, well, maybe it's like this. They throw out a simile, a metaphor, a figure of speech, an analogy. Or they could be a master's metaphor, a teacher's metaphor, where the teacher understands the concept, but creating images to help the student into the realm of understanding casts an analogy. The other thing, too, is all of these analogies and all of these models at the bottom line are more complex than our current understanding. The understanding may be true, but we haven't plumbed the depths of that truth, nor have we seen all of its applications. So consequently, I hold the truth with confidence, but I hold the truth with an open hand. The open hand reminds me that there's more. I have a level of humility. I am able to be open to more wonder, more discovery, and more awe. If you're a Christian, those kinds of things lead to worship and so on. But if I have a bad model or an insufficient model and it needs improvement, Lewis's biggest idea, I've talked about it virtually every time we've met. You can't get away from it. It reverberates in all of his books, and in Miracles especially, or the concept that reality is iconoclastic. I have an idea of God. That idea may be helpful, but that idea is incomplete. And so Lewis says, if I have an idea of God, an image, read a book, heard a lecture, had a late night conversation with friends, that image may allow some of the pieces of the puzzle to come together for me. But the image, once helpful, now becomes an idol. If I hold on to it too tight, it will begin to compete against my having a growing understanding of God. And Lewis says, I want God, not my idea of God. This is very important. But Lewis comes in the book to the section called the Grand Miracle. And what is the Grand Miracle? It basically is about the incarnation. The great miracle is this very miracle we're celebrating in the Christmas season. The God has invaded our world. The masculine force beyond it has come in order to bring about forgiveness of our sins, in order to bring about a sense that our brokenness can be mended, to bring about in a broken world and fractured world a sense of hope. The angels cried out, this is great joy. We bring you news of great joy, that unto you this day in the city of David is born a Savior, Christ the Lord. There's that one Christmas carol, to save us all from Satan's power when we had gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. This is what we're celebrating right now. Well, Lewis basically, in his own autobiography, as he wrote about these things, he says, how could Hamlet ever meet Shakespeare? And Lewis had reasoned his way to theism, but he didn't think he could become a Christian because he needed to answer this question. How could Hamlet ever get to know Shakespeare? And then it dawned on him. The question was a good question. Hamlet can't break out of the play to get to know the author, but the author, Shakespeare, could have written himself into the play and made the introduction possible. And Lewis says, I think that's what happened in the incarnation. The God of the universe wrote himself into the play, became a man, dwelt among us. And he comes on the scene, Christ, he comes on the scene. Lewis writes about this in the Grand Miracle and in Miracles, and also writes these ideas, these themes in his book, Mere Christianity. In Mere Christianity, he says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. Oh, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. Lewis says this is one thing we must not do. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level of a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. When Jesus claimed to be God, he validated it by the things he did. He validated it by the way people would follow him. He validated it by the fact that his resurrection itself, which happened in the city where he was killed, led to the birth of the church in the very city that had been in opposition to him. People saw, they knew, people have been seeing throughout the centuries. The grand miracle is the miracle of the incarnation. But Lewis goes on and writes about two other kinds of miracles as he concludes the book. The first is the miracles of the old creation. And Lewis recognizes that in the creation order, we can see some things that are always happening, where nature is always doing some remarkable things. He says, you talk about changing water to wine. It's true that the miracles of the old nature take what's always been going on and accelerate it. Happens immediately, but water's always being turned to wine. The water that seeps into the ground comes up through the grapevine. The grapes then grow. The grapes are picked. They're crushed. Their yeast is added to the grapes, and in time and aging, we have wine. Jesus gives us that miracle quickly. We see other examples of this as well, the healing of diseases. But oftentimes we get sick and we recover. And the body is doing these kind of corrective things. You get a cut and the cut is mended by the body. It's amazing. And these kinds of miracles, when Jesus does them specifically to heal somebody, that's what nature has always been doing, but it's in an accelerated form. Maybe it's even in an incredibly more magnificent form, because this person who would have died if they would have been left on their own devices, Jesus stops that dying process. We have another one too, calming storms. Jesus calms the storm. He speaks and the storm stops. That's a miracle, but it's a miracle of the old nature. Storms have occurred and storms stop. And this has been going on throughout human history. So the miracles of the old creation, basically he defines them this way. The miracles are in fact a retelling in small letters of the very same story, which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. These kinds of remarkable things have been going on throughout human history. We may not call them miracles because they seem to be a part of our normal life. But the fact that they happen at all is incredible. And then when Jesus comes on the scene and works a miracle instantly, the very things that we see happening normatively and regularly, then we need to understand that is a miracle of the old creation. But then he talks about, and towards the very end of the book, the miracles of the new creation. And Lewis links the idea of Christ's resurrection with the concept of ascension. So between the time of the resurrection and the ascension, Jesus appeared many times to his disciples. Interesting things happened. He was able to walk through walls. He shows up in rooms. But also he was able to eat bread. Usually if we think of somebody passing through walls, we think of ghosts or something like that. We look at the stories of this sort, you know. But Lewis says there's something about Jesus' body that's different. And there's something about Jesus that's different. And in the days before the ascension, between the resurrection and the ascension, we were able to see a miracle of the new creation. That somehow, while we are embodied souls, there's an immaterial part of us as human beings and a material part. What we see in Jesus is sort of a linkage between these two. The spiritual nature of the resurrection is clear, but also its physical dynamic is also clear. And Lewis explained, interestingly enough, that the first problem of life, he writes about this in the Arthurian torso. The first problem in life is, how do you fit the stone and the shell? The image comes from the Prelude by Wordsworth. It's copied into the book, The Arthurian Torso by Charles Williams, and Lewis, in giving his literary critical explanation of what Williams wrote, brings up this image. The stone represents reason. The shell represents the romantic longings of the heart. And Lewis sees that the first problem in life is how do we bring these things together so that we could be as humans whole. He sees that in the fall. He sees in human sinfulness, there is estrangement. We're estranged from God, we who rebelled against him. We are estranged from one another in our anarchistic approaches to life. And consequently, Lewis sees this estrangement comes down to our very beings, that our reason is often separated from the issues of the heart, that our life of the flesh is often in rebellion against what we understand we ought to do morally, but how we function differently. We're just like Paul writes about in Romans chapter 7, the very thing I desire to do, I don't do. The very thing I do is not something I want to do. And Lewis says, in the period between the resurrection and the ascension, we see the miracles of the new creation. We see the kind of thing we can begin to anticipate will be happening with us, where we are able to see no conflict between the life of the flesh and the life of the spirit. The flesh is not inherently bad. God made the flesh. Jesus came in the flesh. We'll be raised with the flesh. Paul says in Galatians 5, the flesh becomes problematic when it sets its desire against the spirit. It's that setting the desire against that shows our estrangement. It's that reuniting in a holistic way, the life of the flesh and the spirit, the life of the mind and the heart. These are the kinds of things that Lewis describes as the miracle of the new creation. Well, anyway, that's the essence of this book. It's a really good book. It's way better than I could ever explain it, but at least I can maybe give you a guided tour through its big issues. You might want to read it. I think it's his most sophisticated of all of his popular apologetic books. Well, anyway, I turn it back to you, Wild Bill.
You know, one of the things that impressed me the most when I read Miracles was kind of how he Lewis tied things together. There's a quote here that I'm going to read, and I want you to get to comment on. Then he says, "Let us suppose that we possess parts of a novel or a symphony. Someone now brings us a newly discovered piece of manuscript and says, this is the missing part of the work. This is the chapter on which the whole plot of the novel really turned. This is the main theme of the symphony. Our business would be to see whether the new passage, if admitted to the central place which the discoverer claimed for it, did actually illuminate all the parts already seen and pull them together. We believe that the sun is in the sky at midday in summer, not because we can clearly see the sun. In fact, we can't, but because we can see everything else by it."
Yeah.
So what struck me was how this was a comment that he makes in the context of talking about the grand miracle or the incarnation. So what struck me was that he saw the incarnation as providing kind of the what connected the dots to all the other pieces of the story, so to speak,
Sure.
and to all the other how all the other miracles that are in the Bible, that they in one sense were pointing toward this grand miracle.
Right.
That was very exciting to me. So comment on that.
Well, I think you commented well on it already. I don't think I need to add anything to what you just said, Bill. You have such a good grasp of these things anyway. But I do think though that one about the idea too about these illumine the big picture. If we found a missing piece of the symphony or the missing piece of the novel, we didn't have the whole novel, we would ask, does it fit? Does it make sense of the rest? And then he gives that image. It's like we don't look at the sun, but by virtue of the sun's light, we're able to see how all these other things fit. He writes that in Miracles, but he also writes the same thing. The very last sentence of an essay he wrote called Is Theology Poetry? You can find it in your copy of The Weight of Glory. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Also, though, interestingly enough, writes something similar in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Professor Diggory Kirk says to the kids, why don't they teach logic in these schools? In other words, if we had sound reason with sound propositions and found foundational understanding, and then we're able to think about those things inferentially in a coherent and reasonable way, we'd be able to make sense out of a lot more life than we do with our haphazard approaches to these things. Just download a copy of the Informal Fallacies. Carry it around for a couple of weeks till you really understand them. And then watch one night of the news, whether conservative or liberal, and you will be appalled at how irrational our general harangue of material that's out there that we listen to is. And consequently, because we're not developing a coherence in our own thinking to see through the informal fallacies, the false analogies, to see through the ad hominem arguments, the straw man arguments, to see through the hypotheses contrary to fact, we end up getting sucked into the vortex of all of this misinformation and misunderstanding. Lewis doesn't want us to do that. And he thinks too, the incarnation does alert us and open us. God, who created, since we have shut him out, has also invaded. He's come. It's cool.
Come to the rescue, yeah. And so Miracles does a great job of showing how that makes sense of the story.
And behind the message too is this: the God of the universe loves us unconditionally. It's amazing. He forgives us. Anybody who's lived honest life knows they have great need of that. And he's willing to enter our life as Lord, because if we've admitted that we've screwed up, we've admitted we haven't managed things well, and he's willing to take over new management. It's cool.
So I'm encouraging, and KJ is as well on the chat room for people to put questions in there. So if you have, now's the time to ask questions, because if you don't, I'll continue to ask Jerry questions. You'll get tired of me after a while.
I see a bunch of quotes in there. Somebody has basically retyped Miracles during the entire talk tonight. It's nice.
Yeah. Okay.
Bill, I've got a question for Facebook, if I can chime in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question comes from Tom Price from the UK. He says, is the issue of miracles similar to Theodicy in that the problem is not the possibility of a miracle, but the evidential problem of their infrequency today? Does Lewis speak to this?
Well, he speaks about these things all throughout his writing. You know, one book is basically a commentary on another book or something like that. I would say there could be some connection between the two. We would say with the problem of evil, as we approach it from Lewis's perspective, he begins that book, The Problem of Pain, with a quote from Thomas Aquinas: "Nothing which implies a contradiction exists in the divine omnipotence." That means there's some things God cannot do. If he's good, he can't do evil. If he is loving, he can't be unloving. If he's just, he can't be unfair. If he's immutable and unchanging, he can't be capricious. He's all powerful to do that which is consistent with his nature, nothing contrary. So if we look at how Lewis approaches the problem of evil and what the presuppositions are he's operating with, we go over to miracles then, and we would say miracles can't be nonsense. They cannot be a contradiction to the laws of nature. They have to be manifest in a way that would be coherent and consistent with nature. Just as we understand the problem of pain and evil, that God's operations in that area have to be consistent too. If he gives us free will, he can't remove the consequences of free will. He can't just interject some sort of haphazard miracle and take away all the bad that we did. If he gives us free will, we have to suffer the consequences of the ill use of that free will. And so consequently, he doesn't do nonsense. To give free will and to take away the consequence would be to give free will and not give free will at the same time. So what does he do? He takes the worst of human free will and turns it on itself. The worst act in human history was deicide. We killed God when God became a man. And what did he do? He turned it on itself and made it his greatest demonstration of love and grace to us. He worked within the system, not contrary to the system. And he accomplished incredible, magnificent good out of evil. It's
Jerry,
miraculous. That's the grand miracle too.
I wonder if the question is really getting at, okay, so if miracles, C.S. Lewis is arguing for the possibility of miracles. Why don't we see miracles today? And then I guess a question would be, when I jotted down, did C.S. Lewis ever personally experience a miracle? And then I think what it sounded like what the questioner was asking was also, why are miracles so infrequent? Or, as a person who's questioning whether Christianity is true, okay, philosophically and all that, I hear Lewis arguing, okay, for the possibility of miracles, da da da. Well, why don't we see miracles?
Well, it's interesting to me that if we have so shut God out and rationalized our materialism and our naturalism, we may have already dulled our ability even to see. Even Aristotle writes about this. Acrasia or acrasia is the word he uses. It's a rationalization of bad act when we do it. So if the heavens declare the glory of God, and if that which is known about God is clearly evident, then how come we don't see that either? What is that a consequence of? And I would say it's a consequence of our living our lives in rebellion against God, where, as Lewis said, when he was an atheist, an agnostic, agnostics talk cheerfully about man's search for God, but if they were, as I was then, they might as well have talked about the mouse's search for the cat. So we've dulled our senses to these things. But beyond that, we may be seeing them more, or we may be seeing the operations of natural graces to such an extent that we haven't given thanks to those. For example, I had students one time say, I had an African student who was in my class, and there were a bunch of American students in there as well. And this African student was seeing all kinds of miracles. They were having crusades in Tanzania. Some of my students went and saw the crusades and saw firsthand people who were lame walk. They saw people who were deaf and blind hear and see. And they said it was remarkable what went on there. How come they have it in Africa and we don't have it here in America? And I said, well, in Africa, it may be exceptional and it may be the grace of God operational in a world where they don't have more profound medicine. But in some senses, in this country, we don't need to see the exceptional miracles as often because we have benefited from people who have studied the world that God has made and nature and come up with medical science that enables us to heal far more diseases than the people in Africa have at a special healing worship service. So I think the whole question is kind of relative. At one level, do we give thanks for what the doctors have produced? Do we give thanks for the new COVID vaccine? I think all of us should be on our knees worshiping God for all this stuff. How was it done? Well, somebody says, well, people did it. There was no miracle there. There was nothing exceptional there. And so there again, we bring our presuppositions to the thing and say, I don't need to thank God for any of this. And I would say, well, I think that you don't see that there are some greater principles operational. Those scientists work with laws of nature. They work with things in nature that have certain properties. They were able to deduce those properties and they worked with them. That's remarkable to me.
Yeah. So some of the issue might be even our language, like laws of nature can give the impression that like these are sort of independent laws working without God's interaction at all, versus a robust Christian understanding would be that God is sustaining what we're calling the laws of the universe. So in that sense, he is actively involved in the universe. And that kind of idea makes better sense of both the world that we see and our minds, which are made in such a way that we can have access to those. Lewis has argued for reason, that reason is something that transcends the purely natural and enables, like you said, our ability to discover those principles in medicine and that sort of thing. But also, I just mentioned this book, if you're interested, The Case for Miracles by Lee Strobel. And he has a couple of chapters in there by Craig Keener, who, did all this research, many of it from Africa, where he researched all these, these miracles and showed, that they were happening there. So they do happen, but as a Christian, we're not limited to just, the extraordinary. Even the ordinary can become a sign of God's activity through His sustaining the world that we live in, and that's the point you're making, and the one that Lewis makes.
I think we've dulled our senses.
Yeah.
We've dulled our senses. I think we have to account for the fact too that you can have some people that think everything is some sort of supernatural expression, and they can overplay that hand too. Sometimes a naturalist may see that there really was a natural cause to this thing. Lewis doesn't discount that, but the natural cause or the natural working works still along certain properties and principles, and we can observe that and still worship God.
Yeah, because those are not independent of God's sustaining presence. That it's not like we're not deists, who believe God sort of wound up things and then went on vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So speak to this for a minute. Do you think, did Lewis ever actually observe a miracle?
I don't know. My guess is he probably did. I mean,
I'm thinking about his he
saw Joy when Joy had cancer. They thought she was going to die.
Yeah.
And Peter Bide came and prayed over her, and she got better for 3.5 years. They were able to marry, and they had three and a half pretty happy years together, actually. Eventually,
and apparently, this guy had a reputation, of praying for people, right. And that's the reason he, invited him to come. So he thought, there was validity to that.
Yeah. Well, somebody could say too, though, well, yeah, but she eventually died. And I could say, yeah, and so did Lewis, and so will you. So the question is, God doesn't, I think, see it as a miracle. Let's prevent everybody from dying. His thing is eventually he wants to have us have the miracle of new creation, new life in Christ, so we can spend eternity with Him. That's the end. That's the place where we're going.
Lazarus eventually died as well.
Say it again. I didn't hear that.
Said Lazarus eventually died as well.
Yeah. And Lewis thought he had he was greater than any of the martyrs because he had to do his dying twice. Maybe the second time he thought, well, this isn't so bad. I've done this before.
Okay. So any more, KJ, you have any more questions from Facebook? Whoa, he just disappeared. Now that was a miracle. Hey, I was going to read a funny quote by Lewis here, Jerry, from God in the Dock, Essays on Theology and Ethics. He says, if the end of the world appeared in all its literal trappings of the apocalypse, if the modern materialist saw with his own eyes the heavens rolled up and the great white throne appearing, if he had the sensation of being himself hurled into the lake of fire, he would continue forever in the lake of fire itself to regard his experience as an illusion and to find the explanation of it in psychoanalysis or cerebral pathology. Experience itself proves nothing. If a man doubts whether he is dreaming or waking, no experiment can solve his doubt, since every experiment may itself be part of the dream. Yeah. Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions that we bring to it.
Which essay was that in God in the Dock?
Yeah, it's in Essays on Theology and Ethics.
Which one? Which God in the Dock is the book, and then it's filled with all kinds of essays.
Yeah, it's page 25.
Page 25, I'll go look it up. Okay. That's a good quote.
Bill, I do have another one from Facebook right now.
Okay.
This comes from Charles in Aurora, Illinois, who's a He's a particle physicist and a buddy of mine. He says, as a scientist, I completely agree with the limitation of materialist worldview. What do I say to a peer who may try to explain a miracle away, saying simply lack of information, and more information we get, we may be able to explain it?
Well, he says maybe. That's honest, isn't it? Maybe. But why would you go with the maybe and project it on the whole? He doesn't do that in his science, does he? He comes up with a maybe in his hypothesis, and he wants to test it to see if it's so. He could still engage in those kinds of tests. I don't think any Christian should ever be disappointed if a materialist wants to say, well, I want to check this out. I want to check this out. I want to check this out before I'm willing to concede that it might be supernatural. The Christian should sit back and say, go ahead and keep checking, because if it is supernatural, maybe you'll eventually get to the end of your checking out. You'll concede it's real. It's real. You know, Thomas, he said, I'm not going to believe until I see him and I touch him and I put my hands in his hands and see the nail scars and all that stuff. So Thomas wanted material objective proof. That's okay. But if the guy has already precluded that there can't be a miracle, then it gets a little more difficult too. Is there ever going to be a time when he'd be willing to concede if he discovered something that was beyond his understanding, or would he say, I'm still going to sit back and wait? That's not really very objective. I think it's preclusive, and that becomes a problem.
So
It begs the question at some level.
I think also if we're not careful, there we could be sounding like we're talking about a God of the gaps. That miracles are so these places where we can't explain it, so it must be God. But with a Christian theist worldview, I think we can say to that question, yeah, go ahead and let's look for an explanation. And if we find an explanation, what we're saying is that because the God who created and sustains the world and these regularities that we see, we're enabled to investigate it and have minds that are able to reason and come, and find the conclusion. That also is a demonstration of God's creation and providence. And so we're free, as Jerry says, to investigate, incidents and not be afraid that we're going to, suddenly close all the gaps and therefore God's not necessary anymore.
There's somebody on here named Sarah Noel who asks, what are your thoughts on praying for a miracle? And I would say, if you feel the prompt to pray for the miracle, pray. I've seen some things happen that I would have never thought happened. Praying for years, almost decades, literally decades, for people to come to faith, and they were not soft-hearted. They were hard-hearted about matters of faith, and they come to faith. I've seen praying intensely for a woman with pancreatic cancer, and she got better. And I remember when the first trip I ever took to England was in 1977, and my wife got an ulcerated cornea. And they were telling her at Moorfields Eye Hospital in London that she was going to lose her eye. And I called up home and I said to my folks and my wife's folks, tell your churches to put them on the prayer chains at your churches that Claudia would get better. And her eye was healed. They were talking prosthetic devices at Moorfields. And before we were home, the doctor said there's no evidence that she had any ulcerated cornea. It's amazing to me. So I think, yeah, if you feel like praying for it, pray for it. But also I think Jesus prayed that he wouldn't have to suffer on the cross. But he concluded the prayer, not my will, but thine be done. He came to die on the cross. He prays this wild prayer that maybe he wouldn't have to. And I think that he validates, and you can pray for anything really, as long as you pray for it under the umbrella of not my will, but thine be done.
So Jerry, speak to say a word about Lewis, the environment that Lewis was living in there, at Oxford, and his appearing on Time magazine in 1947, and the idea that he was a heretic.
His heresy, orthodoxy,
Yeah,
is what it said.
yeah. He actually believed in the devil and
Yeah.
miracles, and you know,
Well, he writes, I'm a thoroughgoing supernaturalist. He believed that you could only account for the universe really in a logically and reasonably coherent way from supernaturalism. Again, back to the basic ontology, or answer to the basic ontological question: if anything exists in the universe of contingencies, something must be eternal and necessary. And Lewis believed it was God. And he felt that was the chapter of the novel that was found, or that was the piece in the symphony that was found, that made sense of the rest of the symphony or the rest of the novel, like he writes about in Mere Christianity, that passage you pointed out, Bill. So, yeah. And he found peace in that.
So this was the kind of the best explanation you could use it. That's back to the sun metaphor again, that if you looked at the evidence, that this made the best sense of the evidence that we, yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
That idea too that I mentioned earlier about a cause universe, a universe that was caused, versus a universe just by chance, that exists just by chance. If you play those out inferentially, one makes sense, the other one doesn't. If there's just chance, then this thing had no direction. If it had no direction, it has no end it's moving to. And two participants raised hand. Linda Walker Kennedy raised her hand. So where's Linda Walker Kennedy? Let's go to her first so we make sure that we, oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. My husband, I even visited Lewis's home in Oxford, met his stepson. That'd be Doug Gresham. I'm a retired Baylor professor. What are you a professor of, Linda Walker? Anyway, I don't see the other. I really do not have a question. This is fabulous. I'm a huge fan of this. Okay, there you go. Anything else? Is there something we've missed, Linda, that you wanted to point out? I don't want to overlook anything.
Well, Jerry, maybe I noticed from reading, a lot of books on Lewis, that this whole debate with Anscombe, with Elizabeth Anscombe,
Yeah.
it made a whole lot of, that Lewis was really bested and he went away, discouraged and this kind of thing. And you, as you mentioned, John Lucas, and he came back and debated.
Anscombe.
Yeah. But what do you make of all the comments that he was down and out because he had lost the debate and all that?
I think it's nonsense, and I think it's not well researched. So the first place where I read this was in Humphrey Carpenter's The Inklings. And I was kind of surprised. I wanted to find out more about it. And then I also read in George Sher. I knew George Sher, but I read his book, Jack, and it's a biography of C.S. Lewis. He was a friend of Lewis's, and he said that he had breakfast with him 2 weeks after the debate, and Lewis said, she destroyed all my arguments for God's existence. Well, her paper was published in her collected papers. Anybody could read it. I read the paper she presented that night. They weren't even arguing about God's existence. So why did George Sher write that? Then you get A.M. Wilson's biography of Lewis, and he said she wiped her out. She wiped him out, and he wimped away, never wrote any more works in apologetics after that. And consequently, he just spent his time writing children's fiction. Well, here are things that count against it. First off, before the debate, he wrote 36 essays in apologetics. After the debate, he wrote 34 essays. It's true he didn't write any more popular books in apologetics because the big themes that he wanted to write about: problem of pain, a basic defense of Christianity and mere Christianity, and miracles. He covered his topics. But he still wrote tons of stuff, including the essay, Christian Apologetics, How to Do Apologetics. He wrote that after the debate. Why? If he was wiped out. The other thing too, what was the first book that he ever wrote as a Christian? It was a work of fiction, and it was called The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. Lewis used his first Christian book. It was an apologetic book, but it was used mediating the apologetic truths through a fiction. And then he wrote Out of the Silent Planet. And when he wrote that, he wrote to a friend and said, I discovered that any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's minds under the guise of romance. Fiction was always a rhetorical tool in Lewis's tool chest. Not only that, while he was writing these popular apologetics, Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, Miracles, he was also writing his science fiction books. He was also writing The Discarded Image, Screwtape Letters. He was always, he was firing from two cannon the whole time. And I just think that there are people who don't like Lewis, and so they make a charge against him and so on. And again, Basil Mitchell, my doctoral supervisor, was there that night. And he told me there were no fireworks. So this is an eyewitness account. And not only that, he was the one who restaged the debate. This is the other thing that's also interesting. If you go to Cambridge University, between the heart of town and Girton College, there's a cemetery. And so many Cambridge notables are buried in that cemetery, including, doggone it, now I can't believe it. Well, anyway, Anscombe is buried there. And she had a big hand in her mentor coming to faith at the end of his life. I can't believe I can't remember. This is a terrible senior moment. I turned 70 yesterday, so I have excuses for any memory lapses I have now.
It'll come to you.
I will tomorrow in the middle of the night. I'll wake up. But nevertheless, she was having a hand in bringing another Cambridge academic to faith at the end of his life. This isn't a person who's opposed to God. So you see some of the stuff that people wrote about it. It's terrible. A.N. Wilson did a horrible job on this particular thing.
So, Jerry, we have a question here from John Summers.
Yeah.
He says, thanks for your walkthrough. In your opinion, where would Lewis place the Old Testament miracles in relation to the old new creation paradigm he offers? Lewis seems to be speaking specifically about Jesus' miracles in the book Miracles.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what Lewis might have done with something like the axe head floating on water in 2 Kings 6.
Yeah, those would be miracles of the new creation. The axe floating in water is not something that we would see nature doing, and therefore accelerated. Axes don't float. The parting of the Red Sea would be another thing like that as well. And Lewis does make some comment to that in Miracles itself. So, but you certainly see a lot of them in the Old Testament during the days of Elijah and Elisha, the days of Moses, and so on.
So Jill asks, where does the definition of science end and the experience of miracle begin? Where is the line? And are those two things in fact disparate?
Are they what? Disparate?
Yeah.
The word science, right? It comes from the Latin word for knowledge. So where does science end and miracles begin? I'm not even sure I know how to answer that. Because certainly a miracle could be something I could know about. And if you mean more traditional science that might be rooted in an approach to life that is more materialistic, although there's many, many scientists, notable scientists who are profound believers in Christ. So I don't really know.
Maybe she's thinking of the word science there in terms of the methodology, a methodology that we use to discover or know certain things. And so in that sense, I guess the question would be, can we use science to discover a miracle?
Well, Lewis argues about that in the book. And he says that a miracle isn't something like you could do in a laboratory. where you repeat the experiment over and over and over again. A miracle happens as a moment of history. And you have different rules that apply to how you make historical judgments over, say, scientific judgments. So Lewis clarifies that pretty early in the book, actually. So if that's what you're implying, I think you just have to say, what is the nature of a miracle versus what is the nature of a scientific experiment? And we would say of that which we learned from a scientific experiment is something we could repeat over and over and over again. Again, like water boiling at 100 degrees centigrade at sea level. The miracles aren't repeated. We don't repeat the resurrection of Christ. His incarnation was a historic event. What we do, though, is we gather historic evidence. He appeared to over 500 people, it says in 1 Corinthians 15. We have eyewitness accounts of him in Matthew, Mark, and John. And so consequently, when we hear the eyewitness accounts, the three witnesses right there, that would hold up in a court of law. But usually we discount it because we say, oh, they were Christians, they were believers, so therefore. I don't think you can go that route. That's to project that this witness is impunged because of their views, even though they may say, I saw it with my own eyes. I think you have to consider that.
What is the difference between spiritual warfare and miracles if both result in a person coming to follow Jesus more closely?
Well, spiritual warfare, I don't know if you mean by that taking on demons, casting out demons. I've actually been involved in 8 exorcisms over the years. They weren't things I sought out, but there were people came to me and there were problems. I was with one guy, real close friend of mine, and this woman was involved in demonic practices and stuff, and she had a ring and she used it in her practice, and we asked her to give us the ring and we put it in the trash can. There was nothing else in the trash can. It wasn't long after that the ring started rattling around in the trash can. I was there when this happened. Well, the thing that's interesting to me, she got this impish grin on her face. I looked at her, I said, so your demons can move rings and trash cans? My God created the universe and your demons are in a heap of trouble. And we cast 8 demons out of this woman. So there's spiritual warfare on that level. There's another kind of spiritual warfare. And that's when I'm struggling with some area of temptation I may have difficulty getting over. And I call in my friends and confide in them, my struggles, friends I could trust who won't betray me with that trust. Or I pray and I ask God to help me. C.S. Lewis said, innocence is not goodness. He's not saying it's not good. Innocence is good, but it's not goodness. It's good because it's unspoiled. It's not good because it's proven character. Innocence is not goodness. Even divine nature, even in her prime, cannot make a virtue a gift. And so I struggle through these things. I ask for divine help as I go through them. I surround myself with other brothers and sisters. I confess my sin to them. They walk me through it. I get through it. Next time I'm faced with it, very deliberately, I get through it. Next time I'm faced with it, very deliberately, but I fall on my face again. Next time I don't fall on my face, I get through it. Next time I get through it. Next time I get through it. Next time I get through it. Pretty soon, it's less deliberate. Pretty soon, it becomes a habit. Aristotle said habit is man's second nature. That's a kind of spiritual warfare also. So you got spiritual warfare doing warfare with the demons, a screw tape-esque type thing. Or you have spiritual warfare like Mark Studdock and Jane Studdock in that hideous strength as they struggle through their own spiritual development.
So Jill, who asked the question earlier, she finishes off, I think I know where she was going now. She says, her point really is, isn't science itself miraculous?
I usually we would say that the miracle, like Lewis says, has a masculine force behind it. So we've got some supernatural force producing the miracle. You could say science works in a world that was created by God, so certainly there's evidence of some supernatural force beyond it. But science can make that world that God has made operate with certain properties and then work within that to produce some certain result. So I'm not convinced that the working behind nature and using nature to accomplish a certain result is the same thing as God interjecting into nature some particular end or outcome that he wanted to perform.
Yeah, so she follows up by saying, gotcha, miracles are not repeatable. So,
I'm not convinced that that's true. We find more than one person raised from the dead in the Bible.
well, I think,
More than one person healed.
yeah, I think what she means though is you can't, like with science, you can repeat an experiment because there are certain laws of nature that enable us to, to do that. But with a miracle, God might use you to, to work a miracle, but you can't just work miracles, like, okay, I'm going to do that, again and again and again.
I think you have to define your terms and be kind of careful here, though, because again, we're talking about historic issues. So with say turning water into wine, I'm not water into wine, turning water into tea. I boil the water. Tomorrow I can boil the water again. Tomorrow I can boil the water again. But if a man is blind and he's healed of his blindness, tomorrow I can't heal him of his blindness anymore because the need's not there.
Mm-hmm.
But tomorrow I still may want another cup of tea.
Yeah.
So I think if you define your terms, you'll find you're talking about two very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's what she's getting at. So Daniel's asking, should Christians be in search of miracles? Isn't it sinful to not actively look for the supernatural?
Is it simple not to actively look?
Look for the.
Should Christians be in search of miracles? And then it's followed up with, shouldn't Christians be?
Is it sinful not to actively look for the supernatural? So he's saying,
I think it could be sinful if you're living in denial of the graces that are operational in the world that God has caused. Again, it says in the Bible, he allows it to rain on the just and the unjust. He brings harvests in their seasons. And so consequently, because God is actively involved in his world, it's good for me to tune my heart to any expression of coherence and consistency and lift my heart in praise to God about that. The fact that we have every year a cycle of the seasons, we should be excited about that fact, that we can plant in the spring and we can harvest in the autumn and we can eat that food throughout the year. I sometimes, if I talk to a skeptic and whatnot, maybe in the midst of the conversation, I'll say, by the way, do you know what time it is? And he'll look at his watch and he'll tell me, and I say, how did you know that? He said, I looked at my watch. How did they get it to be set so your watch could represent it? And I say it's the movement of the heavens. On December 21st, Jupiter and Saturn are going to be closest to each other since the 1200s. And we won't see anything like this again for another 360 years. How do the astronomers know that? Because of the precision of the universe. They can go back and see where things were. They can go forward and see where things will be. This is remarkable. Why? If it's so random, we wouldn't be able to make those kinds of judgments. That itself should lift our hearts in praise and adoration that God's in control of things. Somebody's behind it.
So one more question. This is kind of a shift back to the Anscombe thing. It's just a comment from Justin Phillips. He says, C.S. Lewis in A Time of War, page 105, that the Justin Phillips deals with the Socratic Club and the debate at the Socratic Club. So I don't know, are you familiar with the book C.S. Lewis in A Time of War?
I'm pretty sure I read that one. Is this the one about World War One? His involvements in World War I. There was one by Gilchrist that was written about that. Or is it the one about Lewis during World War II, where he did the broadcast talks and stuff like that? I'm not sure. I have the book on my shelf, the one that he just mentioned.
Yeah, I can see the cover of it, but I think it's the one. I think it's on World War II. And about.
What's the point, though? What's the point?
Apparently, Phillips makes a comment on the Anscombe thing and the debate. Has some comments about that. So he's just saying, see that for, one thing, and I mentioned this when I asked you.
I'll go look at it. Thank you for that hint. Whoever mentioned that thing, thank you for that hint. I will actually go look at it. I have studied this pretty thoroughly. I have a section of it in my doctoral dissertation and so on, but I don't even know if that book was published when I did my doctorate. I'll have to go check.
You see people all over the place with this. I mean, saying all kinds of things that are not. You can't.
Well, part of it, Bill, I think, is if you repeat an error 3 times, then it becomes a fact.
Mhm.
We live in that world, actually.
Yeah.
That's maybe a miracle, right? 3 times, it's false, but you say it 3 times, it's now a fact. And I think that there's nonsense. I can trace it back to its source where this stuff was started and how it was repeated and who repeated it and how they got it and so on. I've been able to trace a lot of that stuff through. And I don't think you need to be put off by the Anscombe debate.
Mhm.
You could look at it from one sense that Lewis was wrong in the fact that if he said that a materialist couldn't make a valid argument, you can have a materialist, you can have a Christian make an invalid argument.
Mhm.
It has to do with your presuppositions and how you reason. That was Anscombe's point. Lewis was saying he was talking about the presuppositions of the materialist.
Yeah,
They
you
were
can't
fundamentally
ground.
wrong.
Yeah, he was talking about the grounding of reason, how you ground reason,
So
and
if you look at it from Lewis's perspective, he was right. If you look at it from Anscombe, and again, they were arguing like this. And again, if you have real doubts about it, go read Anscombe's essay.
Mhm.
It's in her collected papers. It's the first essay in the collected papers.
Well, Jerry, thank you for your time. This was a really enjoyable book and interaction and such. And I encourage folks, if you're still interested in this topic, Strobel's book has some good interviews in there. And also, if you can lift it, Craig Keener's book, which is over 1,000, it's actually 2 volumes. You can, dig further there on the whole philosophical and historical stuff and all that. I'd like to finish by just reading.
Swinburne also has a good book on miracles.
I'd like to just finish by reading a quote from Dorothy Sayers' The Greatest Drama Ever Staged, where she's talking about the incarnation. She says, now we may call that doctrine exhilarating, or we may call it devastating. We may call it revelation, or we may call it rubbish. But if we call it dull, then words have no meaning at all. That God should play the tyrant over man is the usual dreary record of human futility. But that man should play the tyrant over God and find him a better man than himself is an astonishing drama indeed.
Wow.
Any journalist hearing of it for the first time would recognize it as news. Those who did it for the first time actually called it news, and good news at that, though we are likely to forget that the word gospel ever meant anything so sensational.
Wow.
So,
Bill, let me thank you for letting me be a part of this. I've enjoyed these sessions when we've done them. Thank you very much. And for you people that endured and listened and tolerated what went on, blessings on you too. And I hope you have a great Christmas.
well, thank you, Jerry. Great time, and we'll continue after the first of the year. So stay tuned and have a great Christmas. We have a lot to celebrate, just as Dorothy Sayers wrote about there. We're not talking about dull ideas. We're talking about reality with a capital R. So thanks again, and hope to.
And Bill,
yes,
if folks go into the chat, they'll see those 2 articles I posted that we can email out as well. Merry Christmas.
Okay, good. So there are 2 articles there as well on miracles, and so take a look at those. All right. So good evening, and we'll see.
Linda Walker, who was from Baylor, she taught American literature for 37 years at Baylor. Bless your heart, Linda, and bless the students that you were able to minister to.